Welcome back to the channel. I'm Ben. Today, we step into a quiet American town where a child's short walk, a single block on a dead-end street, ended in a darkness no one could explain. We begin with a mother at her kitchen sink, a crying baby in her arms, and a boy who knows the route to the park by heart. A kiss on the cheek, I love you, a small paper bag with lunch, a hop off the curb, and then silence. It is August 2nd, 1993. In Savona, New York, heat still sits on the pavement, but storm clouds gather like a warning. The park is the town's heartbeat. T-ball fields, swings, the sound of kids at play. He should have been there in minutes. He should have waved from the fence. He should have never vanished. Minutes stretch into hours. The air cools. The certainty inside a mother turns into panic. Neighbors look first, then more neighbors, then police. Shoe prints blur in dust and grass along a narrow path, the kind kids cut between sidewalk and trees. Voices call his name. Radius crackle. The sun tilts. A searchline slows as it reaches a fringe of woods just yards from the park, only a few hundred yards from home. There, in the dim beneath low branches, they find what they've been dreading. A small body in the brush. The lunch bag lies torn, a banana crushed to paste. Ants find sugar. On the ground, a red stain that looks like blood but isn't. It smells sweet, artificial, like summer packets mixed at kitchen tables. Kool-Aid, red Kool-Aid. Someone opened the bag. Someone lingered. Someone arranged more than they needed to. This is where we begin, not with answers, but with a scene that refuses to make sense. No stranger's car idling at a curb. No witness ready with a license plate. Only a boy, the woods, the park, and a trail of choices that feels deliberate. The first question in any homicide is always who. Here, on this afternoon, another rises beside it. Colder. Stranger. Why would someone take the time to do this? And what in that red drink was meant to be seen? Savona, New York, was the kind of village where people waved at passing cars, where Friday nights meant little league games, and where children could ride bikes on empty streets without a second thought. It was small, close-knit, and quiet. In the summer of 1993, the Roby family lived just down the street from the park that served as the center of town life. The father coached T-ball. The mother, Doreen, cared for their two young boys. And the older of those boys, Derrick, was almost 5 years old, a burst of energy with a wide smile. A boy who collected little victories, like catching his first fish or running the bases after a hit. Neighbors described him as the mayor of the block because he was always waving, always busy, always known. On the other side of town lived another child. Eric Smith was 13 years old, with flaming red hair and freckles that made him stand out. But in a small town, standing out is not always a gift. At school, Eric was bullied relentlessly. Kids mocked his looks, his high-pitched voice, and his awkwardness. Teachers saw a boy who struggled with speech, who had been held back in class, who often seemed isolated. At home, Eric found some comfort with his grandparents, Red and Edie, who remembered him as affectionate, even clingy, always ready with a hug, always eager for attention. Yet, beneath the surface, frustration simmered. Eric would later admit to his parents that he sometimes felt like he wanted to hurt someone. He described himself as stupid, worthless, destined to be nobody. Words no child should say, yet words that echoed through his adolescence. Between Derrick and Eric, there was no prior connection, no feud, no history. One boy represented innocence, still running with a lunch bag in hand, still learning the rules of T-ball. The other was a teenager teetering on the edge of adolescence, burdened by anger, confusion, and rejection. The contrast could not have been sharper. The beloved child of a tight family, and the troubled boy who spent hours riding his bike alone, circling streets with no destination. Psychologists would later ask if Eric's rage was born of nature or nurture, if bullying and neglect fanned embers already inside him, and the chilling question lingers: could anything, therapy, intervention, compassion, have changed the trajectory of that red-haired boy before he crossed paths with Derrick? The answer lies not in this profile, but in the act itself. Still, when you place these two children side by side, the joyful victim and the alienated aggressor, you can feel how their worlds were always on a collision course. And once they collided, nothing in Savona would ever be the same. On the morning of August 2nd, 1993, Savona woke under heavy skies. It was humid, restless weather, with thunderclouds building in the distance. Inside the Roby household, chaos was the ordinary kind. The youngest child, Dalton, was crying and demanding attention. Doreen, their mother, tried to soothe him while packing a paper bag with a sandwich, a piece of fruit, and a packet of Kool-Aid for her older son. Derrick, nearly 5, was eager to head to the summer recreation program at the park. Normally, Doreen walked him herself, but that morning, with her hands full, she hesitated, then allowed Derrick to walk alone just 1 block, down the same side of the street. No crossings. It felt safe. It was the first time she had ever let him go by himself. Derrick hopped off the curb, kissed his mother goodbye, and trotted down the street. He never arrived. Hours later, searchers found his body in a small patch of woods, less than 200 yards from the park entrance, and only a few hundred yards from home. What they discovered was not just a killing, it was brutality beyond comprehension. Derrick had been strangled. His head was battered with rocks. His small sneakers had been removed and placed beside his hands, as though deliberately staged. His lunch bag was torn open, the banana crushed, and the red Kool-Aid from the packet had been poured into his wounds. Finally, investigators determined that a stick had been used in a sexual assault. The scene suggested not just violence, but a kind of grim performance, as though someone had wanted to leave a message or savor the control. For investigators, the initial assumption was simple. This had to be the work of an adult predator. The cruelty, the staging, the calculated desecration, these pointed to someone experienced, someone monstrous. Parents pulled their children indoors, fearing an unknown killer lurking in the town. Neighbors searched for unfamiliar cars, strangers on the streets, anything out of place. The Robys themselves clung to the belief that no child could do something like this. Even Eric Smith's own grandfather, recalling those first hours, said everyone assumed it must be a grown man. But behind the small-town panic, behind the locked doors and drawn curtains, another story was unfolding. Eric Smith, a boy of 13, wandered the same streets on his bicycle. Hovering near the command post investigators had set up, he asked questions, offered to help, hung around the adults as they worked. At first, no one suspected him. He was just a kid, freckled, awkward, eager to belong. Yet he knew far too much. 4 days after the killing, investigators noted how upbeat he seemed, almost pleased with the attention when questioned. Eric first denied seeing Derrick that day. Then, abruptly, he changed his story, placing himself near the scene. He described the white t-shirt Derrick had been wearing. He even mentioned the lunch bag, calling it kind of cool, details only someone close to the crime could know. As detectives pressed him, Eric's mask began to slip. He grew agitated, his fists trembling. At one point, given a glass of red Kool-Aid by his father, he spilled it on the ground. For the officers who had just processed a crime scene where red Kool-Aid stained a murdered child, the gesture felt chilling, almost taunting. The following day, during a police reenactment, Eric calmly guided investigators around the area, describing what he had seen, but his account didn't match reality. From the spot he claimed, he could not possibly have observed the details he provided. The inconsistencies piled up. Still, no one was ready to imagine that this slight, red-haired teenager was the killer. The truth emerged only after his family confronted him. His mother and stepfather, sensing he was hiding something, begged him to be honest. Finally, Eric broke. Through tears, he confessed, "I'm sorry. I killed that little boy." He was 13 years old. His victim was 4. The gap between them, 9 years, might as well have been an abyss. For Savona, the revelation was almost as shocking as the crime itself. How could one child commit such an act against another? What could possibly drive him? Investigators now faced not just a brutal homicide, but a question that would haunt the case for decades. Was Eric Smith a monster born, or a boy shaped by cruelty until he became one? Once Eric Smith confessed, the case shifted from a frantic search for an unknown predator to the painstaking work of documenting how and why a 13-year-old boy could commit such a crime. Investigators retraced the timeline. They confirmed that Derrick Roby left home with his lunch bag. They mapped the short distance from his front door to the park, then into the wooded cut-through where his body was found. Forensic teams cataloged every detail: the rocks used as weapons, the position of the sneakers, the stick, the red stains of Kool-Aid. Photographs captured the staging that prosecutors would later describe as chillingly deliberate. Detectives began formal interviews with Eric. They noted how he alternated between calm detachment and sudden agitation. At times, he described the scene in unsettling detail, even mimicking gestures. At other times, he insisted he did not know why he had done it. Investigators pressed, had he been abused? Had someone coerced him? Again and again, he denied it. His family members echoed that denial. Still, the cruelty of the crime led many to suspect some hidden trauma. The evidence, however, pointed only to Eric himself. For prosecutors, the decision of how to charge him was unprecedented. In New York State, murder is the single crime for which a 13-year-old can be tried as an adult. District Attorney John Tunney faced a wrenching calculation. To proceed in juvenile court meant a maximum of custody until age 21. To try him as an adult meant exposing a boy, not yet in high school, to a life sentence. Tunney later said that when he looked at the crime scene, the battered face of a 4-year-old child, he saw his own children's faces imposed there. To him, it was murder, plain and simple, and it demanded the full weight of the law. Meanwhile, the community struggled to reconcile what they knew of Eric with what he had done. His grandparents insisted he was affectionate, even loving. Neighbors recalled seeing him riding his bike alone for hours. Teachers remembered his frustrations. Yet now, their memories had to fit into the reality that this boy had lured Derrick from the sidewalk, strangled him, beaten him, desecrated his body. It was not the work of an unknown adult. It was the boy from their own streets. By the spring of 1994, Eric Smith was formally indicted on a charge of second-degree murder. The courtroom in Bath, New York, would become the stage where the question of responsibility, legal, psychological, and moral would play out. Police reports, autopsy findings, and Eric's own confession would serve as the foundation of the state's case. And waiting in the wings was a defense strategy that would argue Eric was sick, not evil, that his violent explosion was the product of a disorder, not of choice. The stage was set for a trial that would test not only the law, but the community's ability to comprehend how childhood could turn to carnage. The jurors would soon face images and testimony that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In the summer of 1994, the courthouse in Bath, New York, filled with an unusual tension. The defendant was only 13 years old, but the crime before the jury was described as one of the most brutal the county had ever seen. The trial of Derrick Smith began with the prosecution laying out stark facts. District Attorney John Tunney stood before the jurors and spoke of a child, barely 5 years old, who had been lured, strangled, battered with rocks, and left posed in a grotesque display. He reminded them that Derrick Roby weighed only 40 pounds, that his life had lasted 4 years and 10 months. Tunney's voice hardened when he said, "Derrick Smith choked and battered the young life out of him." The prosecution's strategy was simple but devastating. Present the crime scene with its cold details and show that Derrick understood what he was doing. Photographs of the wooded patch, the crushed banana, the sneakers beside Derrick's small hands, all were introduced. Medical examiners described injuries consistent with deliberate acts, not an accident, not a sudden scuffle gone too far. Tunney's case rested on one principle, that even at 13, Derrick Smith made choices, and those choices amounted to murder. The defense countered with a very different picture. Attorney Kevin Bradley argued that Derrick was not evil but ill. He called on Derrick's mother, Tammy, and his stepfather, Ted, who described a boy plagued by tantrums since toddlerhood, a child who banged his head on the floor, who struggled with speech, who was bullied mercilessly. Bradley emphasized Derrick's own pleas for help, times when he told his father he felt like hurting someone, and begged to understand why. The defense brought in psychiatrist Dr. Stephen Herman, who diagnosed Derrick with intermittent explosive disorder, a condition marked by uncontrollable fits of rage. Herman testified that Derrick's actions were not premeditated cruelty, but an eruption he could not control. The prosecution challenged this fiercely. Their experts testified that such a disorder was rarely, if ever, seen in children as young as Derrick. They argued that Derrick not only killed Derrick, but arranged his body, desecrated his belongings, and lingered at the scene, acts requiring thought, decision, intent. Jurors listened to both sides, while family members sat in silence. Derrick's parents, Dale and Doreen, were called to testify. They wanted to speak about who their son was, but objections limited their words. Doreen managed only brief statements about her little boy's personality before the judge cut her short. She later said it was one of the hardest moments, to sit in court and not be able to tell the jury who Derrick really was. Witness after witness described Derrick as both normal and troubled. Teachers recalled an awkward boy who sometimes exploded in anger. Neighbors recalled a child who seemed lonely, pedaling his bike endlessly. Yet none of it softened the image painted by the prosecution, a boy who lured another child and chose to kill him. As the days stretched on, the jurors carried the weight of photographs, testimony, and the haunting question, did Derrick know what he was doing? In New York, that was the crux. If he knew, the law required responsibility. The courtroom was hushed when the jury finally filed back. The clerk read the verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder. It was unanimous. Derrick Smith, 13 years old, was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison. For the Robys, the decision brought relief, but not peace. For Derrick's parents, it brought devastation, convinced their child was sick, not evil. And for the jurors, it brought a question that would not leave them. Had they just punished a child, or had they stopped a future predator before he could kill again? Looking back at Derrick Smith's crime, psychologists, lawyers, and the public all searched for a single answer. Why? Why did a boy of 13 lure a younger child, strangle him, and then mutilate the body in ways that suggested not only violence, but satisfaction? The courtroom testimonies painted clashing portraits. On one side, the defense claimed Eric was gripped by intermittent explosive disorder, a rare psychiatric condition where anger erupts suddenly and without control. On the other, the prosecution insisted his actions showed calculation, removing shoes, crushing fruit, pouring Kool-Aid into wounds, posing the body. Such acts, they argued, were deliberate, not blind fury. Eric himself, across years of parole hearings, offered shifting glimpses into his mind. In early hearings, he spoke with disturbing candor, admitting that when he strangled Derrick, he felt a sense of relief, even enjoyment. "Instead of me being hurt, I was hurting someone else," he once explained. That sentence terrified evaluators, who saw not just a child who snapped, but a boy who discovered power in domination. Later, as he aged, Eric expressed remorse. He said he thought about Derrick every day, that he wished he could switch places. But psychologists caution that remorse, voiced in a parole hearing, may be sincere, or may be a performance aimed at freedom. The pattern of Eric's life before the murder offers further clues. He had been bullied for years, mocked for his appearance, isolated in school. He struggled with speech, was held back in class, and often felt powerless. At home, he sometimes told his parents he wanted to hurt someone. Taken together, these are risk factors that, unaddressed, can manifest in violence. Still, millions of bullied children never kill. The difference, experts say, may lie in Eric's internal wiring, his impulse control, his threshold for rage, or perhaps an emerging antisocial tendency. Legally, the case underscored a dilemma: how to treat juveniles who commit adult crimes. Should Eric have been rehabilitated in a system designed for youth, or punished as an adult murderer? The law in New York allowed for the latter, but the debate has never settled. Some argue that by imprisoning him for decades, society prevented further violence. Others argue that if intervention had come earlier, therapy, protection from bullying, a stable support system, Derrick Roby might still be alive. The most chilling thread is this: Eric admitted that if he had not confessed, he might have done it again. That possibility suggests not a one-time explosion, but the potential trajectory of a budding predator. Prosecutor John Tunney later said he feared Eric was a serial killer in the making, and that the trial may have stopped future victims. Whether that is true can never be proven. What remains is the uneasy intersection of psychology and law, a place where certainty is rare, and where the questions are sometimes more haunting than the answers. And so the case of Eric Smith leaves us caught between two narratives: a boy tormented until he broke, or a boy who found pleasure in cruelty. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps neither explains enough. But one fact cannot be erased: a child is dead, and another child, branded a killer, carries the weight of that choice forever. The verdict closed one chapter, but for the families, the sentence was a life of its own. For Dale and Doreen Roby, every parole hearing felt like reliving August 2nd, 1993. Every 2 years, they wrote letters, filmed statements, begged the board to remember Derrick. "We were sentenced to," Doreen once said, meaning that each hearing reopened a wound that had never healed. For nearly 3 decades, the Robys lived under that shadow. Eric Smith, meanwhile, grew from a teenager to a man behind bars. His hair grayed, his voice deepened, but his identity remained fixed. The boy who killed Derrick. At each parole hearing, he faced the same questions. Had he changed? Was he still dangerous? over and over? The answer was no. Parole denied in 2002, 2004, 2006, 2008, 2010, 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018. Each denial brought relief to the Robys, but also exhaustion. It felt endless. Then, in October 2021, the decision shifted. After 11 hearings, the board granted parole. By February 1st, 2022, Derrick Smith walked out of Woodbourne Correctional Facility. A free man, after 28 years, he was 41 years old. His release sparked outrage in Savona. Neighbors gathered, not to celebrate, but to protest. Holding signs, chanting Derrick's name, they feared seeing Derrick in the grocery store, on the street, near the park where the killing had happened. To ease tensions, authorities arranged housing far away in Queens, more than 200 miles from Savona. For the Robys, the release marked a strange turning point. Doreen admitted she was tired of anger. She said she wanted to focus on joy, on her surviving son Dalton, now grown, and on memories of Derrick that were not defined by violence. Each year on August 2nd, the family honors Derrick with ice cream, vanilla with sprinkles, the treat he called white ice cream. At the park where he once played t-ball, a statue now stands, sculpted in his likeness. A gentle reminder of childhood's fragility. Derrick Smith remains a figure of debate. Some see his release as a gamble, a test of whether decades of prison can rehabilitate even the most violent of offenders. Others see it as an unforgivable risk. He has spoken of wanting marriage, work, and a chance to counsel bullied kids. But trust is harder to win than parole. For many, the image of the red-haired boy lingers, not as a counselor, but as a killer. The legacy of this case rests uneasily between two truths: that Derrick's life was stolen, and that Derrick's life, in a different way, was also lost. The question of redemption hangs in the air. Perhaps time will reveal if this story ends with healing, or with proof that some wounds never close. Every story we explore here is more than just a crime. It is a mirror reflecting back our society, our families, and sometimes even our failures to act in time. The tragedy of Derrick Roby reminds us how fragile safety can be, even in a quiet town where children ride bikes down empty streets and neighbors greet each other by name. A walk of just a few hundred feet, less than the length of a football field, can separate a moment of innocence from a lifetime of grief. This case also raises difficult questions about responsibility, justice, and redemption. Can a child who commits an unthinkable act ever truly change? Or are some wounds, both for victims' families and for the community, too deep to ever heal? There are no easy answers, but by remembering Derrick, we remind ourselves of the importance of compassion, vigilance, and early intervention for children in crisis. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Do you believe rehabilitation is possible in cases like this? Or should society always prioritize punishment to protect others? Share your perspective in the comments. I want to know what you think. And if you found this story meaningful, please support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Your voice and your engagement keep these conversations alive. And together, we honor the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves.